Hi, I'm Dave Merlino.
I'm Dustin Sweet, and this is the Know Their Story podcast. We talk to veterans about their time in service, returning home from war, and transitioning out of the military. Hopefully, along the way, we'll inspire you to do the same with a veteran in your life.
Because sometimes all it takes to make the world a better place is sitting down with a friend to know their story. Okay, thank you for joining us today. Welcome back, hopefully, to thousands and thousands of people.
Episode 15.
Episode 15. We are getting there. Joining us from sunny Taos, New Mexico. Actually, a couple people, but Dustin, I don't want to have the whole intro. How are you today?
I'm super excellent today. It's a weird. We've got a lot of the smoke from the fires south of you today. It all swirled around the country and came here, so it's a weird color outside, and that's about it.
Well, you're welcome to it. We had it for 2 weeks up here. And it's good because it's jogathon week at school.
Nice.
So
how far are you jogathoning?
They're doing staggered, obviously, for COVID, so not everyone's running on the same day. Like, they break the class down into thirds and then do a staggered start. They split the difference on masks because can be profoundly dangerous for kids to run a couple miles wearing masks. So as they're out running alone, they're allowed to lower their masks. But I just had to laugh at the whole stay home, stay healthy concept because I saw a lot of kids sucking wind yesterday. And these are the athletes who are sucking wind. Like the athletes of the class were sucking wind, and it went down from there.
Oh, man, that's brutal.
Yeah, it felt really bad. So, but they made it through. So, but joining us today, this is going to be we're excited for this episode. It's something that we wanted to do since we started this. We have a couple different formats for episodes in mind as we go along, and this is our first on this format. Instead of talking to a veteran, our guest today is the daughter of a Vietnam veteran and is married also to a veteran, as people will know from lucky episode number 13. Her husband Dustin was on. You get a better number. And a lot of different vectors, I guess, to go through. My daughters have been studying physics. To go through in terms of both being a daughter of a Vietnam veteran, a wife of a veteran, and also some special relationships with other children of veterans that we will get into. But thank you for joining us today, Miss Tiffany Jama.
Yes, thank you for having me.
I'll cover all the bases. But no, thank you for joining us. And as we were talking right before we hit record, Dustin, you're going to have to quickly figure out a new question other than how did you join the military?
Yeah, well, because thanks for the lead-in, Dave. That's real pro there. Nice segue.
I'm going to toss it over to you.
Tiff, I'm wondering what it was like. A lot of us grew up with parents who were ex-military and didn't talk about it. How old were you when you realized that your dad was a veteran? Was it something that was around, or what was that like?
Well, it was interesting because I knew he was in the Vietnam War. I took his, Army jacket and his letters from Vietnam to third grade show and tell when I was about 8 and told a story about him falling out of a helicopter. But beyond the suit that hung in the closet and these letters, I never considered that I was part of a military family. My dad didn't go to the VA. He didn't participate in anything to do with military life. And then, of course, there was always this looming, oh, your dad hates the 4th of July thing in the family. But it took me until I was a lot older to realize that a lot of the things about my life were the way they were because he was in the military and specifically that war.
Was it, I mean, you knew your dad was in the war, but didn't really talk about it. Were there, I've talked about on other episodes. I remember there was I think I was in second or third grade. One of the teachers in our school was a Vietnam veteran, and he came to talk to our class, and he was pretty super excited about it, brought in his uniform. That's where, in second grade is where I learned what a Claymore mine is, as he explained it to us. And he was super excited to talk, but also a lot of the other teachers and adults had told us, like, oh, don't talk to him about it. He'll have shell shock and it's really rude to talk about it. And of course, as kids, like, oh, I don't want to be rude. But looking back as an adult, he totally wanted to talk.
Yeah, right.
Was it kind of that way for you guys? Like, don't set your dad off, or what was that like?
We were never told to not talk to him about it. But one thing that I've become aware of as I've gotten older and I've kind of gone on this journey of my own around that war is he had a few stories he told. He was a high school psychology and sociology teacher. And so he kind of had these like 3 horrific go-to stories. And what I realized in the last few years, and I also have to acknowledge that I'm not sure I'll ever know if my assessment of him is accurate, if his stories are 100% true. There was a really great chapter in Tim O'Brien's book about how to tell a true war story. And a lot of the things that he said in there really resonated with me, because he was like, there's things that are too horrific to talk about, so you create a metaphor, or you turn your eyes and you maybe missed a moment, and so you fill it in with something else. And so I had to kind of let go at some point that the stories are 100% accurate, and just kind of understand that war is pretty horrific. So we weren't told to stay away from his stories. But for me, I feel like my dad kind of threw out these stories almost like a smoke screen, because what I realized happened, no one would ask a question. They were just so shocked by the information and the story that was the end of it. And I think that is in some way how he stayed the real pain of the war, the real tragedy of the war for him that he experienced as a 20-year-old. And all that he saw and was exposed to, I think it got to kind of exist behind those stories, because that's just, he's given me a little bit more information as I took a trip to Vietnam myself. I got in touch with a lot of guys that were in his unit. I got documents and maps. I got all these things mailed to me. He's given me a few more stories. And that's kind of what I've derived from that whole experience of trying to understand my father better, trying to understand my life better, trying to understand the unspoken things in my life. There's just been a lot of things that were very unclear. And I think a lot of it comes from, not talking about things, not addressing things. He'll say, I have a little hearing loss in my right ear, but he'll never say, I've killed someone.
Right.
So it's this interesting territory.
That's actually an interesting concept. Like, I know that at some point I'm going to have to talk, so here's 10% of it to
right.
Yeah, if I make it the most horrific 10%, maybe it like waves off from the rest and I won't have to talk about it. Yeah.
Right.
Oh, you don't want to talk anymore?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Dustin.
Do you remember how much you learned in school about the Vietnam War? During this project, I was thinking about it, and I can't think of more than maybe 9 weeks in 8th grade.
And when I think about it, I don't think we learned anything about the Vietnam War. I was educated in West Texas, and I started out with a really stellar education at a Catholic school, but then I was switched into a Church of Christ school, and it was almost as though they were trying to keep people as uneducated as possible so they wouldn't know how to question anything. I know. And then I went to a public high school, but I don't recall, anything about learning about the Vietnam War in school. Nothing.
If I have to recall I know I mean, if anything, it was the high overview stuff.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, like this is happening in the background, and here's all the. I remember it was very much like, this is the high overview of what's happening in the war, and here's the things that were happening at home, and those are the things that kind of got paid attention to. Martin Luther King,
Right.
and the
Right.
assassination of JFK, and that kind of stuff.
Right.
But it didn't really touch on the war or what that experience was like for those guys.
Right.
How did you end up? How did you end up becoming interested in your father's service?
I think what happened for me was I kind of identified with the counterculture movement when I was a teenager. It was the 90s. I used to wear his army jacket to school, and I even carried his canteen around for water. But
Nice.
and then I moved directly to the Llama Foundation as a 19-year-old. So my friend base was literal hippies, from the 60s.
Yeah.
And they're fantastic people, and I love them dearly, and they're still in my life. But I very much identified with the anti-war movement and, people who would go down to Los Alamos to protest on the day the bomb was dropped and whatnot. But I realized at some point in my early 20s that I carried a judgment about veterans. Nothing that I did outwardly, but I was always like, I didn't understand it. I had one of those kind of mindsets of like, oh, those guys, oh, the military guys, and then, fast forward, I don't know, 15 years or so, in my mid to late 30s, I started to have my own experience with some PTSD. And I even had some nights where I lived by the hospital here in Taos, and we don't have like airplanes going over or whatnot, but there was a helicopter.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd be jumping out of my bed in the night, peeling the blinds open, wondering what that noise above me was. And I was like, what is this? And I started to realize that there was probably a lot of picked up on trauma that I got from living in that household. So I started kind of just looking back at my life. My dad, he always slept in the living room floor by the front door. And I don't know if it's because he and my mom were having a hard relationship or he was watching the front door. I know he always kind of stepped over by our bedrooms and had a little listen before he would actually go to bed at 2, 3 a.m. But there was a lot of things about my life that I thought were normal that I started to think those aren't really normal, whatever normal is. But so I actually started to watch a ton of war footage. I mean, he'd let me watch, Platoon and all those things in the 80s when I was a little kid. So I was really desensitized to that kind of footage. So I could watch Vietnam War footage, close it, and go right to sleep. No big deal. But what I realized was I was watching this footage, and I'd hear these terms and these words. And I started realizing that I didn't even have the language to form the questions to ask him anything. We just kind of knew he was over there, and in the Army. But I didn't know his rank, what his, job over there was. I didn't know you could have different jobs. I didn't know you could be over there typing, data, or you could be in a rice paddy, or you could be in a field, or you could be on a hill, or you could be on a boat. I had no idea. So I started just kind of eating up all the footage I could find. And the questions started to be formed in my head. And so I actually started really kind of harassing him one day by text, and Dad, and I just wouldn't let up. I was like, where were you over there? Well, where did you land? Well, where did you fly out of? Well, what were you doing over there? Well, and I just kept going and kept going. And then one of the things I asked was, who were those guys that we went to the Vietnam Wall in 1988 to look for? And he gave me their names. And so I started on this, crazy frenzy on Google, searching on these names. And I found this great website for MACV. And it was you could find your team. He was Team 56. And all the men, it was men and children anyone looking for information. And I found one of the kids was named after his father, David Fisher. And I was like, holy crap, this is one of the, people whose dads we went searching the Vietnam Wall for when I was about 8 years old. And so the whole journey has just been kind of intense and enlightening. But at the same time, one of the biggest things I got from it was the most amount of love I could have ever imagined for the Vietnam veterans. I was just like, my heart just blew open for these guys, whether they enlisted or they were drafted, whether they believed in it or they didn't. I just had this massive shift inside myself. And I really started feeling like there needed to be more bridges built between, especially people who feel like they're the counterculture, or they feel alternative, or they're just civilians with no clue what someone goes through in that kind of a setting. And so that's why I feel like this podcast that you're doing is so important, and why I reached out and hope, for great success with it, because there is so much judgment from a lack of understanding, from the mindset that makes someone join the military to, why they carry a gun when they're out or whatever. I see it all the time now that I'm with Dustin, people giving him dirty looks for having a gun and having no idea what he's been through in this world and fought for and believes in. They have no idea. It's just an initial judgment. And so I feel like there needs to be more bridges, and especially from that like counterculture kind of thing to the military. It's like it's the same as it was in the 60s. It's still pretty divided.
Absolutely. It is so many different bridges that can be crossed. And one of the big gaps I think that I've seen is just people who have their information from only movies. And it's just this, okay, you went and did this thing and now you're home. Like, yay, you made it. And are they all the way home? Like, could you go over there and do that? One of the things I was talking to Dustin about on our last filming trip, it's like, okay, think about in your life, is there something that every once in a while you just think about and you're like, God, I can't believe I did that, or I should have done that better, or that you just can't let go of? Now imagine that's war, and you're thinking about your friend who was killed. Now, if you can't let go of this one mistake you made 20 years ago that you wish you'd done better, imagine adding death onto that, and then just telling people, oh, it's fine.
Right.
And so, you said that you started texting with your dad one day. Did the responses come back slowly, or how did that go?
No, he was pretty willing. He gave me the information as I asked for it. And then somehow through that MACV website, that discussion group, there was a main guy on there who had been one of the radio operators, and there were two. They'd do 12-hour shifts. So while my dad was over there in 68, 69, this guy was on the radio, for 12 hours almost every single day. And so he had a ton of information. And so he started kind of feeding me some different information, like the name of the compound, Ekin Compound in Can Tho, Vietnam. And I remember once I had to call my dad about something, and I said Ekin Compound. And it was this really interesting moment where it's almost like in the silence that it took him to speak, the moment, the pause, I could hear the memory coming back to him. He hadn't probably heard Ekin Compound in like 46, 47 years, or whatever it was at that point. And it was, I don't know, there were just some really interesting moments like that are almost hard to speak about or write about, because they just are, it's just such a weird situation. But he was really forthcoming with information. And I think, I don't know why, he started telling me a few more stories. I did make a trip down to Texas where he lives and we went through his scrapbook and he pointed through some photos. He'd be like, there were more awful stories, but I hadn't heard them before. He'd say, oh, this is the radio. The tower at the Canto airfield where this crazy thing happened. And here's what it was, and I started to get a lot better grasp on what he was doing over there and what happened. And, and even that guy that on the Patrick Gillis that was on the radio, the guy who I've become friends with, David Fisher, his dad was also David Fisher. He died in the landmine explosion. Patrick Gillis had been on the radio when they radioed in saying, we're coming down Highway 2, blah, 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 whatever. And then his shift ended. He went to bed. 45 minutes later, he got woken up. The guys had been blown up by this landmine, and my dad was put out on duty to go retrieve their bodies with his good friend, Larry. And so, getting stories from other members of his team, all of it, I didn't tread outrageously lightly like I thought I might. I thought I probably should, but I was cautious in the sense that if at any moment he was like, I can't talk about this, or I noticed his stress going up, I would have backed off. But he raised me to be tenacious. That war, it partly raised me. And so I am how I am partly because of that damn war. And so he never told me it was inappropriate or anything like that. And he just kept giving me info, which was, really kind of nice.
And you're one of the first people that we've talked to who's kind of gone through the experience we've gone through on, our journey for the Apache Blues documentary.
Mm-hmm.
A little more personal since it was your dad. But that we keep trying to drive home to people. Would you say you did a lot of talking, or did you just do a lot of listening?
With my dad specifically, let's see. Well, I know
once the story started coming out, I mean.
He doesn't give really long stories. I definitely listened a lot. I didn't pry with extra questions. Like with Dustin now, he's a lot, it's a different era of veteran. We have a term for PTSD. It's a slightly different world or country that the, Afghanistan troops came back to than the Vietnam troops. So he and I have talked a lot, Dustin and I have. And so I ask him a lot of questions, like very specific, like really specific, that I would never ask my dad. I still let my dad have whatever privacy he needs to hold those stories inside, to not dredge up, those traumas. Because I do remember I read his entire year of letters home to his mom, dad, and sister. And it's like, it's so intense in one way how he's so much a kid. He's writing home about the poverty and the poor dog he saw on the street and the kid with no legs. And, it's just like, he didn't even come from an ideal American childhood. He came from, an alcoholic, on the East Coast in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and hardworking parents. And, but for him, Vietnam was still a shock. And it just was really interesting to watch that year of letters unfold and him go from kind of like, this is going to be the greatest experience of my life, to, don't worry about me, I'm just going to be typing, because he was going to just do a typing job at first. And then he went into, oh gosh, we're going out into the rice paddies. We've lost too many men. They need some volunteers. And then the battles start and the nighttime. I can see how the trauma, the PTSD, all that crept into his world. And one thing that's really interesting to me is my dad's PTSD around like safety shows up in the dark. My dad was afraid of the dark. He had me afraid of the dark. If we're driving around at night and he sees a tree, he kind of half jokingly, but kind of half seriously says, someone could be behind that tree. And I'm like, yeah, in your world, someone could be behind that tree because someone was behind that tree once upon a time. Whereas like with Dustin, more of his worry happens in the daytime. So I'm just starting to put like all these different little pieces together of, how those traumas come in and then how they impact and then stay there and then maybe even get passed on.
So your dad was your first introduction to dark humor to hide real feelings.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And my dad also, my bedtime stories were really, really dark, like really dark. My bedtime stories have alarmed all of my therapists that I've had in my adult life. And, I don't know if he was trying to work something out. I don't know if he just thought it was cool to scare kids. I don't know how much of it was drawn from what he saw over there, but it was a lot of like dismembered children and children going missing. And we'd have to, fall asleep after that. It's
Classic.
yeah, great bedtime stories.
That was a Major Pain, the movie, where he's telling the little story, the engine that could, and then ends up with a fight, and the psychologist like, Major. It's like, what?
Right. Right. It's like, what's the big deal?
And staying along the line of Vietnam, what's it? I don't want to say what's it like. It's such an easy lead in, but to have met other children of veterans who, it turns out, are connected to your dad's service, but is there an instant connection there of just this kind of shared group experience, or how is that community formed for you?
Well, it's been interesting because most of them are older. I'm 40, and a lot of those guys are in their early 50s because, they were either like 1 or 2 when their dads went over there, or in utero or whatever. But, those guys specifically from my dad's unit, the children of them, they're older than I am. And yeah, this one guy, David Fisher, he just loves me, and I just love him so much. And he just emailed me a couple nights ago, and he wanted, if I was pregnant with a boy, he wanted me to name it after him, but I'm having a girl, so I'm off the hook for that. But
well, Davida.
Yeah. Right. So I think what it was those guys, there were 2 of them. There were 4 guys in the Jeep that exploded, and 3 of them had children, I believe. And 2 of them found each other, and I've been in touch with both of them. And they gave me like their life story and how it was impacted by the war and what changed for them so drastically after their dads died. And I'm kind of losing my train of thought. Where was I going with that?
Naming your child after David.
Yeah, no. We've just become really close. The piece that they were missing for themselves was really knowing what happened. They have those letters that they send home, and I've seen those letters. I found some archive online, and they don't say a whole heck of a lot. They're just like, we regret to inform you that, so-and-so has been killed in whatever, this region. And they didn't know what actually happened, what actually took place. And no one really does, because the 4 people that were there died. But my dad, being the first one on the scene to pick up their bodies, at least had some information. And then through my kind of searching and talking to people and looking for information, I was able to get them a lot more information. But just them being able to talk to my dad did something really powerful for them, more so than it was talking to me. One of them really, David, was really more looking for, did my dad ever mention me? Because they were like a high school pregnancy, and then his dad went to the war and died. And he wasn't really allowed to ever speak about him. And I think he actually got beat up by his mom if he did bring up his dad. So a lot of trauma subsequently to losing his father. And so he has had a big wound in his life around never knowing, well, did he acknowledge me? Does he know me? Any of that stuff. And my dad couldn't really answer that question for him. But just getting to talk to someone who knew his dad in the war did something really powerful for him. So for those little things, I'm, immensely grateful that my dad was willing to do them and talk to them and maintain a relationship and provide anyone with any little bit of healing that they could have, because there wasn't a lot of opportunity for that in that time period and in that war. And I think it's just beginning for those.
Yeah, those little bits of closure are really important for us as humans,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we see that every once in a while coming through some of the veteran groups that we've come in contact with through making the movie, and you'll just see a child of a veteran looking for anyone who served with their dad.
Right.
It's like, okay, you maybe didn't talk to your dad about it for quite a while into your life, but for them, I mean, that information flow just stopped
Right.
on the day their dad died. And the Army is not forthcoming, especially if they were in an area they weren't supposed to be.
Right.
Yeah. So it is, that's a great thing for them. But coming forward from that, your husband, as we're talking about, Dustin, is also a veteran. How, for you being the daughter of a veteran, getting into the counterculture, as you were saying, did you ever envision yourself being married then to a veteran, or how has that journey been?
I really didn't until right before I met him. And because my whole journey with the Vietnam War and my dad and his team and all those people maybe started somewhere around 2015 or 2016, and I went to Vietnam in 2019. And then when I got back, I kept thinking, like, this journey has to be over. Like, that had to be the end. Okay, I did that. It's got to be over now. But then I would feel this kind of like weird thing start churning in me, and I'd feel like there was another breadcrumb out there somewhere. It was kind of like this hidden journey of breadcrumbs I had to keep following. And so I just kept going. And I had actually just gone to Washington, D.C. about a year ago, this time last year. And I just specifically went to hang out at the Vietnam Wall. And I got to have all these great conversations. I actually got to help people find some names on the wall. And I was like, okay, where's the next piece of this journey? Where am I going? What am I going to do? And I was like, what's probably going to happen is I'm going to meet a veteran. It's what's going to happen. And but I kept thinking it's certainly not going to be in Taos. It's going to be on my trip to Austin to go to the LBJ Presidential Library or something, but then like 2 weeks later at the gym, there's this guy lifting weights, and I was in this like kind of, rah mood at the gym that day, and he was using something I wanted. So I kind of just kicked him off of it and started using it. And then he started talking to me, and I looked, he was wearing an American flag hat, and I was like, oh, this guy's a veteran. And then the next thing I knew, he's like, can I get your phone number and whatever. So if I hadn't gone on that journey with my dad and had that heart opening experience of really trying to understand as much as you can from a civilian perspective what a veteran goes through, knowing that you'll never fully know, I don't think I would have even been open to the idea of being with a veteran, because it's such a foreign world to us civilians.
You would have told
that. I want to dive into that in a minute, but I want to hear more about your own journey to Vietnam first. I want to know what led to you going, and like how that whole trip went.
Yeah, so I made the decision to go. I had some crazy need inside myself that if I couldn't, get the experience or more information out of my dad to really grasp it, that I was going to go there and try to at least plant my feet somewhere where he had stood. So thankfully, this guy, Patrick Gillis, sent me, I think it was something like 800 photos that he collected from
Wow.
all Team 56 members. Everything from guys that were pilots that had aerial footage to just everything. And put that all together. He actually sent me a 1968 map of the region, the old province names. And then I was overlaying it with like Google Earth, and I was trying to make sure that like my hotel was near something, and I took my dad this map and he goes, well, that's actually the prostitutes were actually down this way, and so I got all this information. But I took my son, who was 14 at the time, with me, and we had a 3-week trip there. And at first we were going to stay down south and just do the war stuff down there, but I decided, well, we're here, we might as well go all over. But yeah, it was incredible. I think my favorite piece of the whole trip, we were, and I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but it's spelled like Kanto. It's in the Mekong Delta.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful, beautiful area, hot, but beautiful. And that's where my dad was. And the highways have been renamed, but the rest of it, the roads are the same. Google Earth overlaid perfectly with my map from 1968. And I was literally carrying the 1968 map around. And I got into a taxi one night to try to find, I knew that like the Eakin compound wouldn't be standing. I knew these certain US buildings wouldn't be there. They've all been taken over by these hotels because they're on the river. So I at least stayed in the hotel where it was called the Province House. Four Corps headquarters was in that region where I was staying. And so I got in a cab, and I just picked like a cake shop down the road. I thought, well, if he drops me off there, I should be able to get out and find this one building that has a chance of still being there. It was where my dad stayed. It was a brand new hotel at the time, and they had to put a grenade screen over it. And the troops stayed there when they came in from the rice paddies. I guess they'd be out there for a certain number of days, and then they'd come in and get a cold shower and whatnot. Anyway, we're kind of flying down this road, which is now incredibly lit up and bright and full of buildings. And I just kind of turned my head at one point, and there was the building. And it had this weird haunting feeling. I only saw the corner of it because there was a tree in front of it, but I knew that was the building. And so I was like, hey, you can let me out here. And I got out, and the building next door to it, which was just motorcycle storage, was the old mess hall that they built them. And what I loved too was that a lot of locals saw me out there, like on my phone, looking at pictures and looking at this building and scoping everything out. Because, one thing that was one story was now 4 stories, but I could see the old roof line of the mess hall, and the building that they stayed in was exactly the same. It just had an awning and a gate and a tree. And all these locals came out to help me, and they found me a translator, and they were like, we don't know for sure if this is that building from your picture. And I had to get in my old files and find one from the side that showed this. They have a lot of buildings where they have it's maybe 4 or 5 stories, but then they have a little extra floor on the top that's only a portion of the building. And once they saw that, they were like, yay, this is it, you found the building that your dad was in. And it just made me so happy. So that I did that early on in the trip. We went from Saigon to Kanto, then we went up north to Hanoi. And I got a little cold on I caught a cold flying up to Hanoi. So I ended up having to stay there a few days, just kind of laying low. It was wet and damp up there, so it was not good for a cough. But then we went to central Vietnam and did some outdoor stuff, zip lining, can't remember what all we did, but I had to try to keep it like fun for a 14-year-old boy and good for me. So yeah, it was incredible. I'll never ever regret going on that trip. You know, I took a month off work, spent a lot of money, but to know that I was like at the building where my dad was just incredible for me.
What was that like for your son, being even one more generation removed? I mean, obviously it's his grandpa, but was it like the 14-year-old boy, this is cool, Mom, but I want to go ziplining? Or was there emotion in it for him too?
Not so much emotion in it. I mean, he had to kind of be with me on this trip because I was actually having, like, for about a year or more probably, I was having an instant cry reaction when I thought about the war. Like you said, Vietnam War, I was crying. It was like I was processing all my dad's unprocessed trauma. It was so strange. So he was having to deal with me already, and I think that made him feel uncomfortable. But I like to think that, you know, as he gets older and looks back on his life, there may be something there for him. He is a skilled motorcycle driver, even at age 14. So he drove us all over. We rented a scooter on almost every town we went to. So that's one way I kept it fun for him and kept him, you know, with me almost on a daily basis going to see things. But I think it's hard for someone that age to grasp what are we doing here, you know. And he hated the food and I didn't love it either. So we had kind of a rough trip that way, where it was like, okay, we know there's a McDonald's in Saigon. I guess we'll go there when we get back. But, you know, it was just kind of like, you got to do what you got to do. Yeah.
So we went to Italy when my daughters were, I think, 7 or 8. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we're walking around Rome, and I almost majored in history in college, but I realized I'd have to be there for another year. So like, I want out. But just walking around Rome and the Forum and Pompeii, it was amazing to me. And there's, we're walking, and we're in the Colosseum, and I'm loving it. And my wife and I told him, like, you are going to appreciate this when you start studying Roman history in school. Like, you haven't had this yet. And so a couple of years later, they started studying, and they're like, we were there and it was so awesome. And I'm like, oh, that's not the way I remember it.
Right. Yeah. I think one thing my son got out of it that was very cool for him was just the way they did things over there. I mean, there'd be a guy on a motorcycle with rebar, like really long rebar, tied, you know, crisscrossed of his handlebars of his bike, just dragging the street behind him for 20 feet. You know, like, he saw these kind of interesting ways of doing things, which his dad also kind of has. He's a little bit of a renegade, Wild West construction guy up here in Taos. And so I think he was kind of like, oh, wow, look at the way they're doing that. You know, look at those people on that tiny plank carrying that crazy stuff across the canal or whatever. So he got some stuff out of it, but maybe not so much for the war.
I was laughing because, you know, we're going through the Forum with the tour guide, and they're like, you know, this is where Caesar stood and gave this speech.
Right.
And I was trying to tell them, like, no, this isn't like, oh, we think in this area, like right here. Caesar stood right here on these steps. Like, you're not nothing. No.
Right.
So, at any point, did you consider, or did you ask your dad if he wanted to come on that trip?
I did, and he kind of thought he might come. And in a way, I'm so glad that he didn't, because he has a hard time with his routine changing and crowds. And oh my God, I mean, I used to get up and be like, okay, we're going to go get breakfast. And I'd be like, oh shit, I have to cross a street. You know, just crossing the street in Saigon, even though it's technically very safe if you just do it how you're supposed to do it, I would be like, oh my God, like, can we pull up a map and find a place to eat with the fewest streets to cross? And my dad would have been losing his mind in Vietnam. I mean, if the PTSD of just, seeing a bunch of Vietnamese people didn't do something to him, which I don't know if it would or wouldn't. Just the traffic, the mopeds, he would have been miserable, which means I would have been miserable. So I'm glad it was my son and me, and instead of my dad and me.
Fair point.
Yeah.
So, Dustin, that cover.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Did you feel like you had the after you found the building, you got back to the States, after you thought about it for a while, did you feel like you had the kind of closure you were looking for in going?
Yeah, well, I didn't know what exactly I was even looking for in going. I wasn't sure what this whole journey even was. Sometimes I still don't know. I don't know if it's over yet. It seems to have calmed down a little bit. Now I have a veteran in my life, and I have a different thing going on. I get different information. I'm actually finding a lot of parallels. I'm getting information from Dustin that helps me understand my dad better. So I don't know if this journey was about understanding my dad or understanding me, or helping some veterans heal. I have no idea if it's over or anything, but I have thought that I would go back, especially to that region on the Mekong Delta. It was just, I don't know, there was something about it that I was like, this is where I would want to be if I came over here. Like, out of all the 9 or whatever cities we went to, except that it's maybe like 120 in the summer and 90 in the winter, it was so beautiful there.
And, talking about now married to Dustin, and this is something that one of the bridges, as I said, there's several bridges that we can cross with all these stories. One of the bridges is our Vietnam veterans that we've talked to for the movie wanting to share their experience with modern veterans and saying, we've got a 50-year head start on you. We made some mistakes. We did some good things. Let's talk about it. Have you been able, either consciously or maybe subconsciously, processed your experience with your dad and let that inform how you talk with Dustin, or seen maybe the veterans today getting a head start on talking and seeing a different kind of progress for them?
Yeah, I think that, and I'm just guessing. I can't say I know any veterans' actual experience, but I forget when the term PTSD, like when that became a thing, but I don't think there was so little understanding about all this stuff back with the Vietnam veterans, and there's more of it now. And I do talk to Dustin about things a lot differently than I do my dad. And it's partly because when I met him, he had already done things like gone to anger management and gotten some therapy and been through this EMDR therapy that helps with blocked memory and blocked traumatic experiences. So he'd already done a lot of that kind of work. And, I do body work. I actually do myofascial release, which is really well known for these prolonged deep holds. And what often happens in the tissue is old locked up memory, body chemistry from a traumatic experience that gets kind of solidified and crystallized in the tissue can come out. So I was like, yeah, that's great. I'm glad you've done ABC, but there's this component of your tissue memory. And so he let me start working on him, and, this whole other range of stuff started coming out. And, he's given me a lot of information about how you're actively taught to compartmentalize experiences so that you can get back out there and be combat ready. And that is something that is very useful, perhaps in war. It's not the greatest tool for all realms of life. And so that's, sometimes I'm like, he's like, oh, I've actually been kind of hiding my feelings about this thing. And it's like, sometimes I'm pretty good at picking up on what people are really feeling, but sometimes he really hides it well, so that's an interesting component to being in an intimate relationship with a veteran is all these tools that they've been taught and tools for survival. And, you know, it's been very, very eye-opening in its own way for me.
Yeah, and we've approached this, you know, for the most part, we've talked with veterans. For the movie, we've talked to some of the wives of the veterans, but we always ask the veterans of what would be a way that a family member could approach you or talk. And from your perspective, to talk to family members of veterans, what advice would you have for them about approaching a father or a spouse or anyone?
You know, I think it's okay to approach them. And I think it's like with my father, and you know, I don't have a lot of reference. I have my dad and Dustin, but you know, I had a lot of understanding of that war. I had a lot of understanding of what those guys went through and where they're at with it, how compartmentalized that war is for them. And so I definitely believe in approaching it from a perspective of like some compassion. And I'd like this information. Like if you feel like you need that information as a child, to feel comfortable asking, but also be very open to that you might get short answers. You might not get a whole lot of information. You might have to ask other people who are more open to talking about some of the things. And that if you can kind of derive a lot of information from what you do get, if that makes sense. Like you don't necessarily need it all, but you know, just like for me to realize my dad's big stories were smoke screens to hide something, that in itself is a lot of information. I didn't need to say, well, what are you hiding behind there, Dad? You know, what's going on back there? You know, I don't need him to have some massive breakthrough. You know, if that's a part of his life and his healing, then that's what that is. You know, I didn't expect him to get outrageously emotionally involved in my journey. You know, he was on it with me as much as he could be. He thought it was cool. He thought it was amazing. You know, there's stuff I'll never know, but I can know a lot of it from reading about the war, listening to other stories. I don't need all the gruesome details. I don't need to know every single thing that happened, and you may never get that. And I think that's at some point I realized that's their war. I'm an outsider. And I started kind of giving it back to them in a way, because for a while I was wanting a lot for my own understanding. And I don't think I did anything inappropriate or, you know, anything that I am not comfortable with. You know, the people that wanted to talk gave me the information, the people who didn't, and that had to be enough. And then I kind of felt like energetically, I just handed it back to them. Like, that's theirs. I will always be an outsider, even though I feel like it's in my DNA because of how I was raised. There's a lot of things from those battlefields that are in my body that help me become who I am today. And then that's my journey to figure out. So I don't know if that really answers your question exactly, but, you know, and then with Dustin, he's my husband. And I ask all kinds of questions, and he's never said like, I can't talk about that. We did have one incident one night where I made him lasagna. We were first newly together, and the lasagna looked like something he'd seen in the war, and he couldn't eat it anymore. You know, and it was like, all right, you can leave the room. We're going to put this food away. You know, you go be with yourself.
That's interesting. I never thought about lasagna, but it is, I mean,
Yeah.
Triggers are triggers for different people.
Yeah.
You were talking earlier about piecing together your dad's story. One of the parts that that Dave and I have discovered in doing the doc is that we couldn't get any of the guys to talk about themselves. They were so proud of each other, and they were so gallant in speaking about each other that they had to they couldn't talk about themselves. So like to learn about one guy, we have to ask the other guys, and they'll happily tell you everything about him, you know.
Interesting.
And that,
well, no one wants to put themselves above the team. No one wants
Right.
to look like they're putting themselves above the team. So it's very hard for them to say, I did this.
Right. And then the
Right.
other guys
Did do that.
say, you know, I watched him do this thing, and you're like, that's the most heroic thing I've ever heard of. And you like write it down in your notes, and you're like, oh, it goes along with these other 40 things. That's incredible. What are you guys talking about? And they're, you know, they're also so
Well,
I don't call it self-deprecating, but their unwillingness to speak about their own actions.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because we've had a couple test screenings of the first draft of the movie that we did, the rough cut, and now we're working on the final. But even in the rough cut with the test screenings, their stories are so seamless together. We kind of had to remind the audience, like, this is the first time the veterans have actually seen what the other guys said. Like these interviews took place weeks, months, and sometimes years apart, but they all fall in when they start talking about the team and what everyone else did. It looks like they're all in the same room having a round table.
Right. Wow.
So yeah, it seems weird to have to remind the audience that, like, no, they didn't know.
Right.
So,
Right. It's fascinating.
And they also didn't care. Really interestingly, like they're I don't know. I don't want to fall down the side trail of that, but they trust each other so much that they were like, yeah, he's going to say what he's going to say, and I'm not worried about it. And that level of camaraderie is rare. Until you get into the veteran community, and then it's all over the place. You know.
Right.
It's a normal thing.
Yeah, which is one of the things Dustin has talked about. We've talked a little bit about the difficulty of being out of the military, being in civilian life. You know, he has a tendency to want to spend all his time with me. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm an introvert. I have friends. I need to get away from you every now and then. And for him, he's like, the thing he's missing from the military, you can't really get in civilian life. So then there's that loss and that grief and that adjustment. And then like his family has just, his immediate family has become such a huge, filler of that old space for him. So that's been an interesting thing for me, to be so captivated by someone like, okay, you've got my attention all the time. I'm here.
Well, yeah, and we talked about that last week with Ryan of the military is so team oriented and so camaraderie oriented, and society today, unfortunately, is not. Society today is very individualistic. Sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. The good with the bad there, but it is a very individualistic society. So it's really hard to leave a team, not only to leave your team, but then to come back to a place where there are no teams.
Yeah.
And on the other side, it's hard for society to be like, no, like we make our own way, make your own way. And what would we've talked to people. Charles, our cameraman, was saying he was talking to a girl one night, and she's like, oh my God, my dad's a Vietnam veteran. And I'm kind of like, Dad, you're home now. Like, it's over, get over it. And he was just so mad at her.
Incensed.
Yeah. Even years later, he's just so mad. And that is one of the bridges. Like, no, it's not over. So what would you say to society? Not to society as a whole, but to people, advice for them to bridge the gap who don't have contact with veterans on a regular basis, of how I'll back to it, we as a society can get better at that, just understanding.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like it's important to educate ourselves, because I think people can get so caught up into the right and wrong or the politics and, disagreeing with what our country is doing, maybe in a particular area, when we don't even really know for sure, what's going on. I think people stay away from actually touching into learning about veterans and the military and the human beings that are in there and what they're having to do, because it's just easier in some way. So I would say find a local veterans organization, do something, get a hold of the VA. I don't know if they can give out information of names or numbers, but find some way in your community, talk to your neighbor. There's veterans everywhere, and just talk to them, because you'll come away with a much different understanding, especially if you can go into it without judgment, if you can go into it with some curiosity. Because I mean, even just in the last couple of weeks, we've had a lot of tourists coming into Taos, and someone wouldn't take Dustin's order because he had a gun, on his hip in the Lotta Burger the other day. And some, young kids came in and gave him some lip about being a redneck. And I'm looking at this going, well, this is really interesting how we just see something, judge it, label it, and dismiss it. And people aren't coming from their hearts. They're not coming from compassion. And I'd like to see a lot more of people having curiosity and creating their own bridges just by reaching out and asking some questions. What'd you go through? What do you want to tell me? I don't know the right questions to ask, but there has to be more of that, because the divide is so drastic and so uneducated that it's not creating, I feel like, a good situation for the veterans, for the civilians, and for our country as a whole. And it just keeps driving a bigger wedge between people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to immediately backtrack on one of the things I said about individualism. We're not totally individualist, because it seems in politics today, everyone has their team.
Right.
Having worked for the government, for Republicans and Democrats, no one's team is better. I hate to break it to everyone.
Yeah.
They're not. I worked for both of them.
This is just as awful as it was last year.
There was a very key trend of when our local senators cared about border security, and it seemed to be every 6 years. I'll just put it that way.
Right.
Gonna throw that out there. But it is that is the one team we have left, and I think people are really afraid to hear opinions they may not like, because they don't want to have to reevaluate their team.
Right.
We're joking with Dustin that Dustin Sweet and I have spent, I mean, we've known each other since college, but
I still think the Sedona story is the best. We walk up to this short film festival. We're at this film festival in Sedona, and we're showing our film, and they ask us up to the front, and we get up there, and we're talking for about 5 minutes, and this guy stands up and goes, you were law enforcement, and you, sir, are wearing an anarchy belt buckle? I want to know what that's about.
That's awesome.
Because we can have differences with each other and still be friends.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Right.
And I'm also not afraid, and Dustin's not afraid to say, that's just really dumb.
Yeah,
and not be offended by it.
Right.
So, I mean, yeah, it's, no two people, even my identical twin daughters, are not the same. Right. And we have to be willing to accept that we're not all the same.
Well, and every time we come into this, I want to reiterate, man, the thing that makes America stronger is our differences, man. Like, that's what bridges this country together and really holds us together and makes us better than everywhere else.
Ooh, getting deep.
Feisty.
I'm going to circle back around on something that we talked with Dustin about 2 weeks ago. By the time this episode comes out, 2 weeks ago. We talked to him about what it's like for people to thank him for his service. And we talked about it a lot, but there still was a lot of humor involved. And so I want to say, from your angle of watching it, how do you think he kind of accepts it when people will say thank you for your service?
He's gracious to them, for saying it. I think when we talk about it later, you know, he realizes that it's kind of a standard thing to say, but they also took the time to say it, and that means something. You know, I don't say that to people, but I do, when I don't end up a big bag of tears, try to welcome home anyone who's wearing a Vietnam veteran hat. You know, if as long as I can do it without being like, oh my gosh, look, now I'm crying. Can you please take care of me? I'm so sorry for what that war did to you. You know, I just try to, you know, because they're all wearing those hats now, which is awesome, or they have a bumper sticker. And so I try to say welcome home, specifically to the Vietnam veterans. And yeah, you know, he has even been at the doctor with me with my legs in like gynecological stirrups. And the doctor's like, oh, thank you for your service, you know. And it's like, it's sweet. To me, it's at least an acknowledgement that they know people are doing things that are difficult so that they didn't have to. So I think it's well received, you know, for the most part. From what I've seen, you know, we've only been together a year. And yeah, that's kind of my take on it. I think it's appreciated in some way. And then, of course, I'm sure sometimes it doesn't feel genuine, and it's just kind of like a soundbite that people are so used to saying.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say in terms of when you see a Vietnam veteran. On our first filming trip around the country, 7,000 miles, we had Craig Jorgensen, one of our veterans, came with us to catch up with all the other veterans. And for 7,000 miles around the country, if he saw someone with another Vietnam veteran hat, remember we were standing in the Alamo and looking, and he suddenly walks 100 yards because he saw a hat. And at first they do the 20 questions to make sure they're both real Vietnam veterans. Right. But there's such a connection anywhere across the country, anyone wearing the hat, they always talk to each other.
Yep.
And it is really great for what they came home to now be able to actually be proud of that.
Yeah.
Or to the point that people want to lie about service and say they were in Vietnam. That's a huge 180. Gone from don't talk about being in Vietnam to pretending you were there.
Yeah, no, I've wondered. I've seen some people with some signs asking for money, but it said Vietnam veteran, and I was like, that's interesting. You know, I wonder if anyone would ever lie, but I didn't want to ask the questions to trigger any bad memories to find out.
Even for us, you know, having come into this, we've been on this for 4 years now, and we've gone to their reunions, and some of the guys joke that we're honorary veterans of Apache Troop. And really, with all the information that's come into us, we might be the holders of one of the biggest collections of Apache Troop history in the world. But I do feel that connection. And sometimes I see something on the internet about Vietnam vets I know is wrong, and it pisses me off. I'm like, that's not. And I'll see people holding signs, and some doesn't seem right. And like, you don't look old enough, or you've misspelled things. And I'm like, you know what? No, like, you don't know enough. I'm not going to be one of those guys who only knows enough to be dangerous and calls out a real veteran. Like, our guys, because, you know, today it's Airborne Ranger, but their hats are Ranger Airborne. So we've had people call him out. Craig, who's literally on YouTube getting shot in the war with 10 million views, has had people call him out for being a fake veteran. I'm like, beep boop, here it is. So yeah, it's been a weird journey for us to have gone from being born after the war, not being taught it in high school or any level of school, to feeling this connection so closely to them. It's been fun. So, well, for me, I won't speak for you, Dustin.
Yeah, I don't know that I'd call it fun, but it has been incredibly stimulating in all of the ways, and a fun journey.
Are you saying sitting in a hotel room in the middle of Kansas for a day off was not fun?
I had a great time. That was fun. That was not fun. That was contextually speaking, it was fantastic, and I don't think I'd do it again.
Well, and I will say, when I was at the wall last year, and I did wear my dad's shirt there, And so that, of course, it drew some veterans to talk to me.
Yeah.
They're so grateful that anyone from our generation is even thinking about them, because a lot of them have children who don't think about the war. And so, I don't know where my journey is going to take me. I don't know if I'll compile a book of stories of children or veterans, what I'm going to do. I'm going to have a baby, so everything's going to be on pause for a while, but I still think about it. And I remember back to just specifically being thanked for having an interest. So you guys have that too. And so you're holding a big piece of that for these guys in their hearts. And just for them to have some acknowledgement and someone to honor what they've done and what they've been through. And, it's an incredible gift to them. So I just wanted to share that with you.
The first reunion we went to was in DC, and we went to the wall with a bunch of them. And that's a moment I'll cherish. And I mean, I've been to the wall before, but to go there with Vietnam to be not just to go there, but to be invited to go with them as they looked up their friends was,
right.
I almost felt weird for document. You have to remind yourself, well, you are a documentarian. You got to document this.
Right.
You just want to live in the moment with them. I will always cherish that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one of the best things I've ever done with my life. I don't know if it was fun.
It was fun because it was in the middle of summer. It was almost 100 degrees. We're double fisting water as we're going, and all the veterans were just hungry, but there's no restaurants around the mall. And so from 2 blocks away, we see a hot dog cart, and one of the veterans, Doc, who's from New Jersey, is like, "Oh, we're going to go get hot dogs." I said, "Well, what if they're $10 a hot dog?" He's like, "I'll never pay that." They were $10 a hot dog. And I remember he was like, "What?" But he ate it because
hungry. Yep.
So
how have you found any you've just been living how long have you been living together with Dustin?
Just about a year.
About a year, right? How you said that some of the parts of living with your dad kind of prepared you, like there's differences, but then there's similarities in those differences.
Yeah.
Are you what are there some of those that you want to talk about?
There's things like when we first got together, he was always jolting awake in the night at the slightest noise, and I was like, "Oh, I know this," or up looking out the window. "Oh, I know this one too," or just not being able to sleep. And I remember, I think on it may have been our first date even, where I was like, "Are you going to need to sit facing the door?" Because I was raised with, PTSD like crazy that I didn't even know was PTSD from my dad. And I don't even remember him positioning himself places, but somehow I just knew he's probably going to want to watch the door, not have his back to the door. And he actually sat with his back to the door anyway, but things like that. And then we were talking recently too about my dad. One of the ways I feel like he maintained some sense of control in his life was through diet and exercise, to the point that I think he could actually have been diagnosed with what they call a male eating disorder, just because it seems more acceptable in society, like these bodybuilders. But there's a point at which it kind of actually becomes, a disorder. It just doesn't show. Yeah, it doesn't show up, or it's the only thing you think about. Your calorie intake. Do my pants feel tighter? Oh my God, I'm getting fat. Oh, I ate some pizza. Oh my God, I'm a fat slob. This is like my dad's dialogue with himself. And so he hasn't missed a day of working out my whole life. And, he's like, pick me up something to eat, but it's gotta be low cal, this, whatever. And so it's like, I was just talking to Dustin the other day, and he was talking about this massive obsession he had with diet and exercise at some point in the military. And I was like, what? I bet that came from, just needing to control something, which is what they say about things like anorexia or whatever. It's just, they never get a diagnosis for it because, they're men. Men don't have eating disorders, do they? But yeah, they do actually. So there's a lot of things like that. And, my dad didn't let me, my bicycle riding distance was the house next door to in front of our house to the house next door. So we went back and forth because he needed to be able to look out that window and see us. If he couldn't see us, we were dead. So I've had some incidents where I didn't answer my phone, or I ran over an appointment giving someone a massage, and Dustin's driving by the house I'm at or whatever, making sure nothing weird has happened to me, so there's that inability to like calm the thoughts when they get out of control about someone's safety. Those are all very similar to my dad. There's a lot of similarities. So I'm just like, hey, I know this. I'm like, oh, you're my dad. You're just like my dad, which is okay because I love my dad.
Right.
It's like the Back to the Future meme of, hey, I've seen this one.
Right. Yeah.
So this is the point where we turn it over and say, is there anything that we didn't cover, or any thoughts you have, or anything you'd like to say to our audience of millions?
Audience of millions.
Oh yeah.
What an opportunity.
Wicked popular.
Oh yeah.
Wicked popular. I'm just grateful to you guys for doing this. You're doing what I wish I could be doing with my time right now. I don't know when I'll cycle back to doing something like this. Or if the journey's over for me, or what's going on, but I'm just very grateful that you're both doing this. I think it's so important. And, I would say to the listeners, encourage people to talk to a veteran, encourage them to be curious about a veteran. If they don't feel like talking to one, at least be curious and start that inner questioning of, what is this judgment I hold about? And where does this come from? And how can I myself be a bridge in this world to the people who have served this country, whether I agree with it or not?
Yeah, the veterans are not the war. It's the warriors are not the war, is
right.
One of the early taglines we had for the movie. We have yet to meet a veteran who was the one who sent the troops into Vietnam, or
right.
was the one who declared the war on Iraq or Afghanistan.
Right.
They all said, no, I was told to go there.
Yep, absolutely.
And I was told when I could come home.
Yep.
So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you guys. This has been awesome.
Well, and to our listeners, we will say, no matter where you are listening to us, the myriad of podcast channels that we are on, if you like what you heard, and you must have if you're still here right now, if you like what you heard, give us a subscribe, give us a like, tell your friends, tell your enemies if they'll listen.
That's right.
That's okay.
Buy a billboard, put our jam on it, something. Help us out.
But thank you so much for joining us.
You've been listening to the Know Their Story podcast. If you made it this far, we must be doing something right. Let us know by subscribing to our channel.
And think about sitting down with the veterans in your life, because saying thank you for your service should be the beginning of the conversation, not the end.